This podcast recaps key content from your unit on fault-based grounds for divorce. There are several eras of divorce throughout U.S. history. For a significant part of U.S. history, the only way a couple could divorce legally would be through a private bill enacted by the legislative branch. Then we moved toward an era of fault-based grounds. This was a very contentious and adversarial phase, and so we started to include aspects of conversion divorce, where if you had lived apart long enough, we would convert that to a fault-based ground for divorce. Then we moved into an era of no fault, where today we have states that include both fault and no fault grounds, and we have states that are just pure no fault grounds. The only way you plead for divorce is irreconcilable differences. So you completed this chart for the week, and it was a party. Whoop, whoop. I know you loved it, but it will be a very valuable study tool for your exam. And it reveals just how limited many of the bases for fault-based grounds for divorce were historically. The chart will be the governing law on the exam. So I review a few key themes from the week. First, I think we all know who's going to pop up under this heart. Hi, Matt Damon. A few visuals to remember: adultery. I think of Matt Damon a lot when I think of adultery. That's Matt Damon, the 92nd Street Park in New York City. That is me on the other side of the fence. My daughter is tucked just below that, thinking her loving mother is taking a picture of her, but I'm not. So a few rules to remember when it comes to adultery. The challenge here is, how do we prove adultery? We don't want to create a world where people are incentivized to chase down or stalk or hire private investigators to determine if their spouse is having an adulterous relationship. So instead, we look for one of two scenarios that function as circumstantial evidence. Either an adulterous inclination coupled with an opportunity to consummate. That's Tiger Woods. The idea that you might just be generally inclined to commit adultery and you had an opportunity to commit it. Or the Matt Damon version is when someone, let's say, I don't know, me, has an infatuation with a particular person and an opportunity to consummate that. I mean, there's a fence between us, but whatever. So, this is the historic frame for divorce. If you're trying to prove adultery as a fault-based ground, you have to prove either a general adulterous inclination, Tiger Woods, or an infatuation and an opportunity to consummate. Hi, Matt Damon. I'm here. And next, we talked about family-based violence. Think critically about the differences between what we think of today as domestic violence, which could include psychological harms, emotional harms, financial harms, as compared to the fault-based ground for divorce of cruelty, which requires conduct endangering the life, limb, or health, or creating a reasonable apprehension of danger, or unnatural and infamous conduct making the marital relation revolting. So one act might be enough, but it would have to be particularly brutal. Generally, there's a strong policy undertone to this rule here, suggesting that courts historically were willing to allow a fair amount of violence within the context of a marriage before it would amount to cruelty. Next, we talked about desertion versus constructive desertion. And no clip better introduces these concepts than the movie War of the Roses, in which neither of these two members of this marriage want to be the one to exit the home. They love this home and they don't want to forfeit the marriage. They don't want to be at fault. So instead, they both work militantly to drive the other out. Next, we think about connivance. We learned about connivance in your chart. This is the express or implied consent by one of the parties for the other party to engage in a misconduct that would otherwise constitute a fault-based ground for divorce. Hall pass and indecent proposal are both strong cinematic capturings of this rule. We also study this idea of collusion. This is what I talked about we'll talk about briefly next week in our discussion of client counseling and ethics. But historically, New York only allowed divorce if you could prove adultery. And so often, if a couple wanted to get divorced, they would basically collude together to manufacture facts suggesting that an adulterous act occurred when everyone knows it didn't. So that's an example of collusion. It's really a strong historic relic with not much modern significance. But what we take away from our material here is the reality that we had a lot of things we should have asked Cody and Sarah when we first met them. We didn't really ask facts to uncover if there were grounds for abandonment. We have some facts suggesting some abuse, but will it rise to the level of cruelty? And frankly, we never asked either party about grounds for adultery. So these are some things we want to work into our client counseling going forward. This podcast highlighted some of the key points that you should